And you're live. All right, welcome everybody to a joint hearing between Senate and House Education Committees. This is Thursday, March 13th, 2025. The purpose of our gathering today is to kind of switch gears from our own worlds and get a better sense of what the news is coming out of Washington, what we know of the current impacts, what we might be able to predict for future impacts, which I know is going to be really hard. So we're going to begin with the point of view of the Agency of Education, and then get some information from folks in the field who have been part of national conversations as well. I think we're probably going to be limiting it to sort of the K-12 arena, but we certainly know there are impacts at the higher education levels as well. Anyway, welcome, Anne, if you just give a formal introduction.
Sure.
And we look forward to your testimony.
Great. Hi. It's good to be here with everybody. I'm Ann Bordenero, for the record. I'm the Director of Federal and Education Support Programs at the agency, and my job has never been so exciting. So I prepared some testimony, and then I don't know if you also got the updated testimony. It doesn't make too much difference. I only changed one little thing, but as you can imagine, just about anything you put on paper is obsolete about 30 minutes later. So I'll do my best, as long as everyone takes with a grain of salt that, you know, there's just so many unknowns. First of all, I just want to reassure everyone that the agency is monitoring extremely closely everything that's happening in Washington. We have some really good informants, which I assume are probably going to overlap with the informants of some of the folks from who are also going to be joining me today. So the Council of Chief State School Officers and the Bruman Group, who regularly presents to the National Association of Leaders of Education Programs or whatever, NALPA, which is sort of the national ESEA organization, and our congressional delegation. So they're all monitoring this on a momentary basis. The funding situation, as I said, is in extreme flux, as you know. We continue to get funding information. We continue to get new guidance and dear colleague letters almost on a daily basis. We're trying to dissect those for people. We've also, in my division, we also operate the child nutrition programs in the state. So there's also USDA to monitor as well. So anyway, I'm happy to come back as many times as you all need to keep you up to date on what's going on, but I'll tell you what I know as of today. First of all, FY25 appropriations. I think you're probably aware that the Senate, maybe as we speak, is going to be voting on the continuing resolution that the House passed a couple days ago and then left town. It's unclear what will happen. All the latest prognostication is that the Senate will in the end vote for it in order not to be blamed for shutting down the government. If they don't get the votes, the 60 votes in the Senate, then there will be a government shutdown tomorrow. That's not the first time we've dealt with a government shutdown. What happens in those cases is that we get very concrete written directions about what to do. But basically, our programs continue. The only real problem for us is when we need to talk to staff, depending on how long the shutdown happens. If it happens, you know, they obviously, except for the core skeletal essential staff, aren't there to answer our questions, but we're not particularly concerned about that. The alternative is that they could pass appropriations bills for FY25, which is, I know, what the Democrats and the appropriators in the Senate would prefer, but that doesn't seem to be on the table today. So we'll see. The bill that did pass the House, the continuing resolution, just continues funds for one more year, essentially at FY24 amounts, which in our world is good news at this point. That means that ESEA, Elementary and Secondary Education Act, IDEA, Perkins would continue basically with the funding we had this year. So that we consider a win. But things, as I said, could change. We're not anticipating significant education cuts in FY25, however, regardless of which path they choose. The other thing to know about education funding is it's what's called forward funded. So we're actually still
Not anticipating cuts in what year? Because I think you said 24.
Fine.
Oh, five, sorry. Yeah, I might have said 21 by mistake. No, we're halfway into FY '25, but we're not anticipating significant cuts in FY '25 that would impact any of our major formula programs.
What is a federal fiscal year?
That's what I was going to say. Federal fiscal year is October 1 to September 30. It's very confusing because education programs are also forward funded. So we're still operating on FY '24 funds, which we got in July of '24 and October of '24. So for FY '25, we will get our first, well, we hope to get our first allocation on July 1 of '25, and the second would come in October 1 of '25. So it's basically the '25-26 school year. So the bottom line of what I'm saying is we are not anticipating cuts of any substantial size to our core education programs for the '25-26 school year. And that is good news. Child nutrition programs are different than education programs. They are a sort of entitlement. As long as the child qualifies for a free or reduced price meal and the school serves them that meal, the school is entitled to be paid for that meal. And those reimbursement rates are set in federal statute. They change once a year, they're updated. At this time, we haven't heard anything about any problems with those reimbursements. So we've advised schools to continue to serve meals and that we will continue to expect funding for those meals. One thing we did do, though, is with our amazing child nutrition director, you probably know Rosie Kruger, is anticipating that there might be a shutdown, which could impact access to the staff to process the reimbursements, put out a call to folks to go ahead and put their reimbursements in if they could as soon as possible. So we did a larger than usual reimbursement for meals over the last couple of months, I think last week. In terms of title program allocations for school year '25-26, we expect those to be late. They've been late many years in the last, 5, 6, 10 years. What we tend to do, we have processes for that. We tend to do a preliminary allocation of a certain portion of what we anticipate to be the full allocation for an LEA. So we say we're going to give everybody 80%. If we hear that the FY '25 budget has been passed, continuing resolution or whatever, we can anticipate what the funding is going to be. Even if we don't have it in hand, they haven't given us the spreadsheet, we'll give everybody, say 80%, and then we'll reconcile it when the final numbers come down. We've got processes for dealing with that. In terms of FY '26, that is more complicated. FY '26, we expect the president and the administration to release their budget proposal probably sometime in the next couple of weeks. That's what they're signaling. We also anticipate that they will probably try to use, what's known as a reconciliation strategy to pass it, which means they wouldn't need any Democratic support. So it wouldn't be the first time that an administration has done that. But if that happens, that makes more likely a lot of the cuts that they've been kind of signaling might be included in that budget. Republican leadership in the House and Senate are looking for substantial savings to offset proposed increases in military and immigration enforcement funding, spending. I'm sure you've heard about that. Extension of the 2017 tax cuts, lifting of the debt ceiling. Those are all expensive. And so they're looking for ways to cut, to balance out some of those increased expenditures. So some of the things that we're tracking, because they would be of big concern, are a reduction in the federal share of Medicaid funding to states and increases in eligibility requirements for Medicaid, and also cuts in SNAP funding and increases in eligibility requirements for SNAP benefits. I think it's premature for us to go into what that impacts those might have, several steps down the road for us in education yet, because we don't know what's going to happen. It's still pretty far out there, but we're tracking those. The other thing is that last year's House Ed budget proposal called for significant cuts to ESEA programs, Elementary and Secondary Education Act programs. They did not pass. The Senate blocked them then. We anticipate that there will be some proposals to cut ESEA programs again in the FY26 budget. But again, we don't know by how much or which programs. All we have to go on is what was proposed, last year that did not succeed. The one thing that works in our favor in this regard is these programs serve every school district in America. So they have strong constituencies, IDEA, Perkins, ESEA programs. Everybody gets Title I, everybody gets IDEA. So that helps, whenever there's conversation about major cuts, there are many groups who raise their voice in defense of these programs. In any case, because of forward funding of education programs, any cuts that might be enacted for FY26 wouldn't impact schools till school year 26-27. So we're looking a year after next year at the earliest for significant cuts, if there were any. Couple more things. I'm sure you heard that Department of Ed staffing was substantially cut 2 days ago. And on top of the voluntary resignations and some of the DOJ cuts and probationary employees and all, they're now looking at about half as much staff as they had, a week ago. As best we can tell, the major cuts have come from the Office of Civil Rights, which investigates, discrimination complaints. Institute of Education Sciences, which is the research arm of the Department of Education. So the National Center for Education Statistics and the National Center for Education Research. And then the Office of Post-Secondary Education, which deals with with higher ed and student loans and Pell Grants and all that. The Office of Special Education Programs, the Office of Career and Technical Education, and the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education, which are the three that we really deal with in K-12. They have not sustained significant cuts and are still communicating with us. We're still working with them. So I'm sure it's very difficult for them right now. And we anticipate that there have to be some reductions in their ability to be responsive moving into the coming months, just because people will be picking up statutory responsibilities that weren't theirs. But for now, our programs are intact and our staff appear to be in their offices, the ones we usually deal with. Ed is supposed to be issuing guidance in the next day or so regarding all of this and who's in and who's out and who to talk to about different issues and all. We haven't received anything yet, but that's what we've been told. Do I have time to switch to executive orders?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm sorry, I'm talking fast, trying to get through a lot, but
Very helpful.
okay. In terms of executive orders, they've been coming like confetti. I picked out two that I think have the most significant impact on K-12 education. One of them is the Dear Colleague letter on Title IX enforcement. And basically, this letter communicates that the Office of Civil Rights will enforce Title IX through the 2020 regulations, not the 2024 regulations that were promulgated by the Biden administration and vacated by the court, I think in December or January of this year. Basically, what that means is the biggest difference between 2020 and 2024 for our purposes is that discrimination based on gender does not include gender identity or sexual orientation in between these two sets of regulations. So basically, OCR will be investigating cases based on the definition of gender in 2020 regulations. In terms of two others that have caused great consternation among educators in Vermont and elsewhere, there's the FAQ on DEI and Title VI, which followed the Dear Colleague letter on Title VI. And basically, these two documents elaborate on the kinds of curricular and instructional and policy actions or inactions that might trigger an investigation by OCR and how such an investigation would proceed. Now, in the FAQ and in the letter, they acknowledge that they do not have the right to overstep on First Amendment rights of students or teachers, and also that the federal government does not have authority to dictate curriculum to states and localities. So they acknowledge that. However, within that, they say that that the First Amendment and curricular prerogatives of school districts do not relieve schools of their requirements to make sure that they abide by Title VI, that hostile environments based on race-based policies are not created in their schools, that students are free of racial harassment in their schools, things that we already, fully embrace here in Vermont. The other thing is that the FAQ identifies some considerations that OCR might consider when deciding if there was a complaint, when deciding if it was justified. It's actually pretty helpful reading as far as those go. In terms of investigatory processes, they lay out what that would look like. And again, there's a strict sort of process of due process that has to be followed in the case of any investigation. And they acknowledge that, and that's a strong protection for us. It's not like if a parent made a complaint, you instantly lose your federal dollars. It doesn't work like that. And the last thing that's probably caused the most fear is they put out a new simplified web form for parents, students, community members, whatever, to put in complaints of harassment and discrimination. In some ways, it's actually a good thing because it's easier to access than the old way of filing a complaint, but people have had the right to file a complaint all along. So there's no new right there. The only difference is that it's very easy now to just go online and put in your complaint, whatever it is. That has not changed in any way our grounds for deciding if there's educator misconduct. All of our rules are exactly the same as they were before. And so our general advice to what we call the field, teachers and administrators and all, is to continue to do what you're doing. Pursue your planned professional development, pursue your instructional activities in accordance with your own SU's priorities, your needs assessments, state board rules, education quality standards. And if you have questions and concerns about any particular activity that you're involved with, consult with your, LEA legal counsel. But we're not advising people to, preemptively stop doing anything they're doing just because they're afraid they might, be getting in trouble with some sort of amorphous set of standards. And I can say we were pleased that after our most recent iteration of this recommendation, that some multi-state guidance was put out by the Vermont Attorney General, along with the Attorney Generals of 13 other states, essentially saying the same thing about these Dear Colleague letter and FAQ that I just described. And their conclusion is that this document was intended to instill fear, and they are writing as attorney generals to mitigate that fear. So the whole document, again, is worth reading. But two other things, in case you're interested. I brought the actual dollar amounts of our various federal grants, if you're interested. And the last thing I wanted to say is I won't talk about it unless you're interested, but I know there's been media reports about the grant to the state that was cut or eliminated about local foods. And I'm prepared to, just tell you what that's about if you are interested.
Yes, I think we have time to hear that.
Okay, so the local foods grant, 1.2 million approximately, it came about during a Biden era program. This particular program came about during the Biden administration as a response to the supply chain challenges during the pandemic. And Vermont got funding last year. And it was great. And so we put in our application and we were awarded the funding for the 1.2 million. And of that, almost $1 million was going to go to schools. And a good chunk was also going to go, about 277,000, to preschools and food banks. And basically this was to use this funding to procure local food, from local producers to supplement and enhance their meal programs. It does not take the place of the Vermont state-funded local food incentive program. That program is still, intact. These funds weren't built into people's budgets at the time they were building their budget, so it's not like money's being taken away from folks. It is it's a big disappointment for our producers here in Vermont that they're not going to get the funding they intended through this, this buying to support their local production, and it's also means that schools are going to have to use other food sources that are not necessarily local and not necessarily as high quality, and might have to potentially, with the high food costs right now, dip into, more into their budget than they would have intended to meet food costs. But this was a kind of supplemental nice program that existed on top of our existing programs. And it was just eliminated across the country. So we, among all the other states that, put in their plans, just learned that nobody's getting any money.
Thank you. Yes, Representative Taylor.
One quick question about, you talked about how the information and guidance that's kind of come down for educators. How is that getting down to the level of the educators? I think that's a really important thing.
Sure. So our way of communicating, which we reevaluate all the time, is that we communicate through something called the superintendent's update on a weekly basis to superintendents, with the idea that they will then communicate to principals and teachers and all with that information. We also have listservs of principals and teachers and, special ed directors and others. So often if the content in the superintendent's update is relevant to those other folks, then it will also get passed along by, say, our special ed team to the special ed directors. So if people aren't getting the word on some of these things, and we've heard that in some cases they're not, we're also exploring other ways, like maybe putting the superintendent's updates, or at least portions of them related to, say, federal communications on our website. It's tended to be, there's a lot of information in the SUPS update that isn't really relevant except for superintendents. So we don't want to just post everything, but we are looking at other ways, because we've heard that some of this communication isn't necessarily getting down to the classroom teacher level. And that isn't usually an issue, but in this day and age, it needs to be. So, yeah.
Senator Rashid, did you?
Was a question on the grants, and I was wondering if we could get a copy of what grants we get from the federal government, and actually, just a copy of what the grants are.
Sure. I'm sorry I thought about doing this last night after I'd already submitted because I thought someone might ask. So I can send it, or I can just have someone copy it. But basically, ESEA, and there are a number of programs under Elementary and Secondary Education Act, but the grand total is around 68.5 million in this current year. The biggest of those by far is Title I, which is about 42.7 million. But then there's Title II, which is teacher professional development. There's Title III, which is English language acquisition. Title IV, which is safe and healthy schools. Title IV-B, which is after school. 21C, it's called after school and summer programming. There's McKinney-Vento, which is the education of homeless children and youth grant. And then there's the migrant program, which we subgrant to UVM, and they operate that program on the ground. Together, those come to approximately 68.5 million. IDEA, which has various components, birth to, I think, 3, and then 3 to 5, and then 5 to 21 and all, is roughly 37.5 million. And Perkins, which is career and technical education, is roughly 5.9 million. And I can send this specific breakdown
If you
to.
would send it to Annie and she can.
Sure.
You're welcome.
Share it, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Senator Heffernan.
So I just want to clarify, I wasn't here for when you were talking about the grants. So the grants we possibly won't, it's not a definite no, it's just a possibly we might not get these grants. Is that what that means?
So, no,
For 24 to 25, will we still see that money, or them grants could go away?
we are not expecting any fundamental changes in these numbers for next school year.
So
Which would be
25.
FY 25 federal, which is 25-26 school year. We don't have the budget yet. It's being voted on as we speak, but we're not expecting we expect roughly the same amounts for next school year. For FY 26, which would be the 26-27 school year, we are anticipating that there will be cuts. We have no idea how much or to which programs. All we have is the proposal from the House Republicans last spring rather, that did not succeed. But now there's also a lot of change in Congress as well. So To eliminate any program requires congressional action. These are congressionally mandated programs, so you can't just get rid of them. However, there's no saying that they couldn't decide to fund them at different levels. And I don't know if you heard me say that I think one of the things that we have going in our favor is that all of these programs are national and every school district participates in them. So yeah, so that's a benefit or a protection, I guess, to some degree.
Okay, and then the final question is just to make sure, as far as funding, everything will be good for 25, 26. It's 26, 27 that we need to be preparing for, looking down the road to say, hey, this is where the cuts can happen. So if we have constituents that are really well, what's going to work happen next year? It's like, well, we're pretty good for 25, 26. After that, that's when we got to start being prepared that we could lose major funding.
Yes.
Okay.
I say everything with a grain of salt because nothing has been passed yet, but every indication is that 25, 26 will be okay. We're pretty solid on that. Our inside sources are telling us not to worry about 25, 26.
Where does Medicaid fit into this? And
So Medicaid is an indirect contributor to this. And so where to start without going into a long thing? So free and reduced price meals, eligibility for free and reduced price meals is sort of the foundation of deciding who is low income and who isn't, for all the many, many, many reasons that information matters. So whether it's state weights for the state funding formula, or it's eligibility to operate a community eligibility provision school meals program, or it's when you do Title I, they do something called ranking and serving, where they have to rank their schools by poverty to decide which ones to serve, which ones are eligible to be served, which ones can operate a school-wide program. Poverty numbers are used for pretty much everything, teacher loan forgiveness. And so if eligibility requirements, for example, for Medicaid, including requirements for families with children, not just single adults, were to change, to be reduced, or made more difficult, there might be less families with children qualifying for Medicaid, which would then mean that they are not directly certified through Medicaid for free and reduced price meals. Now, they still might qualify through a school meals application, or they might be getting SNAP, or some other, they might be in foster care. There are other ways to qualify for a free or reduced price meal, and therefore be deemed low income. But Medicaid has turned out to be one of the best ways. We joined the Medicaid demonstration project 2 years ago, and it was hugely beneficial because it's the program that probably has the most comprehensive uptake across the state. And so we're pretty certain that when a child is in a family that qualifies for Medicaid, we're pretty sure that we have very good coverage of the children who are in fact eligible for free or reduced price meals based on that Medicaid data. That was also the first time that we ever could use a program, a means tested to qualify children for reduced price meals, not just free. SNAP only goes up to 130% of poverty, but Medicaid goes well beyond. And we were able to work with our partners at the Agency of Human Services to get those children on Medicaid who are in families with 185% or less of the federal poverty level and 130% or less of the federal poverty level. So we have poverty numbers that we're really confident in these days with Medicaid and that are pretty robust. So if there were cuts, significant cuts to either Medicaid or SNAP, we would anticipate over time that our poverty numbers would go down and then the cascade of impacts from that would follow. As I said, it's a lot of ifs. So, but we are keeping a strong eye on that, as is every other state who's in the same boat.
questions. And thank you very much. That was very, very helpful.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Chelsea. Will you and Brooke be testifying together?
I'm going to ask Brooke to kind of give like a real example after I'm done with some written testimony, if that works.
That's great.
So yes, together. Chelsea Myers, Executive Director of the Vermont Superintendents Association. Brooke, do you want to introduce yourself now?
Sure, Brooke Olson Farrell, Superintendent in Slate Valley.
And I'm gonna try to be not redundant on the fly here, because a lot of what Anne said is in my testimony, but I'm gonna try to hit some points that maybe are not were not spoken about. And first, I just want to start with the first several months of President Trump's second term. School districts have faced significant uncertainty from a barrage of executive orders, congressional activity, and court decisions. This testimony outlines the key developments and their impact on K through 12 schools across the country and here in Vermont. And talked a little bit about the executive orders. I just want to point, there's a link in my testimony of a summary from Ed Council. It's a resource that I've used quite frequently, but it's a running list of EOs impacting schools and kind of their interpretation. So I highly recommend taking a look at that. I did not include a list of them because it is kind of getting lengthy. Typically, the Office for Civil Rights has a robust process for investigating complaints. However, activity in Maine suggests a different approach. This is how our national partners, the School Superintendents Association, described it. In Maine, OCR, HHS just issued findings of Title IX noncompliance without investigations or voluntary resolution opportunities for the state or district. OCR's approach suggests that federal civil rights agencies may be shifting toward aggressive enforcement tactics that bypass traditional investigative processes, allowing them to pursue violations without expending significant resources. And so the reason I put this example from Maine is just thinking about the way in which processes have traditionally existed. OCR complaints would typically go through a lengthy investigation process, but we're seeing evidence that that might be shifting in terms of the way in which they deal with those complaints. There is an anticipated executive action to dismantle the Department of Education, pointing to perceived ineffectiveness through NAEP scores and ARP spending. The secretary was tasked with facilitating closure within legal limits, acknowledging congressional authority over the department's core functions. The department began cutting over 1,300 jobs and closing offices to this end, heightening over the last couple of days. So we're watching that very closely. Lawmakers have questioned what this means for vital programs like Title I and IDEA, the law that supports students with special needs. And concerns remain despite the Secretary of Education suggesting that those programs would persist. I think I heard Anne saying that those programs tend to have pretty strong bipartisan support. They're pretty favorable in Congress. The Trump administration launched a public portal, ndei.ed.gov, encouraging reports of diversity, equity, and inclusion practices in public schools, which they label as divisive and indoctrination. This initiative, celebrated by Moms for Liberty, who strongly oppose diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, coincides with a deadline threatening schools with federal funding cuts if they fail to eliminate such programs. The portal allows parents, students, teachers, and community members to report instances of discrimination based on race or sex in publicly funded K through 12 schools, effectively creating a mechanism to police and potentially dismantle diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives nationwide. And one of the things that we're hearing from educators is that this is stoking quite a bit of fear about what they are teaching in the classroom. And which is why I included it. And I imagine Brooke might have some additional comments when she starts to speak about some of the impacts of the EOs on her staff. Anne mentioned the Department of Agriculture program ending, so I won't go into that. And then in congressional activity, Anne also talked a lot about the federal funding and considerations there. I have a similar read on things. It is unclear whether Congress will move through the remainder of FY25 funding for school year 2025 to 2026 via continuing resolutions. The best references we have to what may result from FY26, so school year 2026 to 2027, Funding proposals come from what we know from the last Trump administration and the FY25 House appropriations proposals, which I included a chart in there about some of the title funding. The former was marked by block grants and cuts to critical programs. The latter, seen in the above chart, makes considerable cuts to vital title programs, impacting communities serving high proportions of vulnerable populations. Title I, for example, the House proposal looks at about a 25% cut in that title program. And I can't emphasize enough that the school districts that will be most impacted are the school districts that most need the resources. Other areas anticipated to have contemplated cuts are the school meals program. You talked about Medicaid. Mont Arty restricts Medicaid reimbursement to students with IEP, a restriction that is no longer required. And so more Medicaid cuts around provision of mental health services could have some dramatic impacts on school systems, though it's not a huge pool of money for schools. Another area to watch is the expansion of federal programs in support of private school vouchers. The Educational Choice of Children Act proposes a $10 billion annual federal tax credit program to fund private school vouchers through scholarship granting organizations. The program would divert taxpayer funds from public schools, with studies showing that most voucher recipients already attend private schools. In a tax credit scholarship system, individuals fund vouchers instead of paying taxes. So it's a one-to-one dollar per dollar tax credit, reducing the government's revenue by that amount. These tax incentives would be available to both individuals and corporations. Some Supreme Court activity to watch. There's a lot of Supreme Court cases that will impact education this season. And a couple of them include the E-rate program. So the U.S. Supreme Court will decide the fate of the E-rate program as it reviews 2 cases challenging the funding mechanism. This follows a July ruling by the 5th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals, which deemed the fund's financing structure unconstitutional. Since E-rate relies on this fund to help schools and libraries access broadband services, the court's decision could have significant implications for its future. So again, that's related to access to broadband for vulnerable populations.
So right now, I think in Vermont, it's shown that rural schools, to help them have access to broadband, they've been getting discounted rates through the E-rate program, is that right?
Yes. You'd have to ask someone at the agency how much that's utilized. I don't actually know how much that's utilized in the state of Vermont, just that it's a $3.2 billion program. Another court case, Mahmoud versus Taylor. In January 2025, the U.S. Supreme Court agreed to hear the case concerning the constitutionality of a group of parents in Montgomery County, Maryland. They argue that their inability to opt their children out of lessons involving storybooks with LGBTQ+ characters violates their First Amendment right to freely exercise their religion. This will determine whether the exposure of views contrary to one's religious beliefs is enough to violate the Free Exercise Clause. Another court case, Oklahoma Statewide Charter School Board versus Drummond. This will determine whether barring a non-secular school from participating in a state's charter program is unconstitutional. The only thing that is clear is the tremendous amount of uncertainty that Vermont's educators are contending with right now. Given this uncertainty, the VSA has, and I wrote 3 on accident in my testimony. It's 4, I added 1, I got a little greedy, asks of state leadership. So first, ensure there is clear guidance and support for schools to interpret the activity at the federal level. Consistent communication with school leaders is key right now. I had a meeting with superintendents the other day, and they likened it to when we first got into the pandemic. Like, that is the type of communication that they're hoping for moving forward, because that's kind of what it feels like with the barrage of information coming out of DC. Number 2, don't make us more vulnerable to the federal expansion of vouchers and continued course cases surrounding non-secular participation in choice. Address the lingering disconnect between the tuitioning programs, the Carson v. Macon decision, and Vermont's compelled support clause. Number 3, commit to and outline a statewide approach for contending with potential funding cuts. If we leave it up to individual districts, the districts with the highest reliance on federal funding and those with the highest percentage of students in poverty will be shouldering the brunt of those costs. Number 4, recognize the impact that all of the information shared today has on the morale of educators and the feelings of fear and uncertainty across communities. Consider the impact as you navigate the education transformation proposal in your committees. And I think Brooke can share some of what I was speaking about related to the disproportionate impact on certain communities.
Sure. Thank you, Chelsea. So as I think most of you know, Slate Valley still does not have a budget. So
Brooke, you would
we-
just introduce yourself.
Yes, Brooke Olson-Farrell, Superintendent, Slate Valley. So I think many of you know Slate Valley has difficulty passing budgets at the local level. And right now, based on the cuts that we made the other night, we cut an additional $500,000 from our local budget. So now we're the 11th lowest spending district out of 119 districts in the state, and still concerned about passing that budget in April. In addition to that, we're one of the highest poverty districts in the state. We get about $2.7 million in federal funds. And those funds fund every academic interventionist that we have. They fund all of our school psychologists. They fund some of our administrative positions like director of curriculum, director of special ed at the central office level. They fund our behavioral coaches and supports. They fund internet services. So to say, if we lost federal funding, it would be catastrophic is an understatement. We would have difficulty operating. We could not meet anything really as it relates to Act 173. Our MTSS system of supports is almost entirely federally funded. We would have difficulty meeting IEP requirements. So it is pretty critical. And because of the uncertainty at the federal level, the school board did ask me to meet with all of our grant funded personnel today, at least our title funded personnel today, and write in their upcoming contracts that their positions are contingent on grant funding. So I met with 20 teachers today and let them know that due to the uncertainty at the federal level, because there are no guarantees while we assume that things will be okay for next year, every day that seems to change. So they all received contracts today with that in it, and to say there was a lot of emotion is an understatement. And so I'm significantly worried about retention and stability in my district as a result of really funding at all levels.
Thank you. Do we have some questions? I would, Brooke, does the, what sort of fear has the sort of reporting portal for parents and community created, if any?
We haven't heard a lot about it in our district per se. I think there's just a lot of uncertainty, especially from our principals, about how to respond to these executive orders and what they should be doing in the classrooms and what they shouldn't be doing. And so I just think there's a lot of wonders, and I'm not sure that we feel necessarily that we've been provided adequate guidance from the state level on all of that. But it's perhaps because the state doesn't know as well. So.
Anybody else? Thank you both very much for your time this afternoon and for enlightening us on this. And I'm not sure we have power to do much here, but it's good for us to be aware. That's it. Do we have your testimony? Okay.